John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we're reading Hellblazer number 93. But just a little catch-up before we get into that. John has been staying with his friend Rich and his partner Michelle and their son Syder and hanging out with them for the last couple issues. And everything seemed to be going good. John was having a good time. His friends seemed to be fairly okay with him. They were a little bit wary because they knew he had a shady past, but they didn't know exactly what it entailed. But unfortunately, that past kind of caught up with John because, unbeknownst to him, there was a demon named Buer, and I guess he was like a lover of the First of the Fallen. So because John beat the First of the Fallen, Buer has been sad. He wants to get revenge for the First of the Fallen. And it actually turns out that the First of the Fallen did not die at the end of Garth Ennis' run. He just became mortal. So he's been living in Greece as a fisherman and kind of having a horrible time of living as a human. But Buer was able to track him down, and he has said that he will get revenge for the First of the Fallen. So Buer ends up finding out where John Constantine is, and he has somehow been able to possess the child of Rich and Michelle named Syder. And he's just a little kid, so of course they're freaking out. It's literally like a scene in The Exorcist where there's a little kid tied to a bed, and John is in the room trying to get the demon out. And that is basically where we left off. John was talking to Buer, but he doesn't know anything about him. He doesn't know why the demon wants Syder specifically. All he knows is that this is a very powerful demon. So first things first, we got the cover of issue 93. It is a very interesting cover. In the foreground, there is what looks like a steampunk version of a Victorian factory or workplace. And that's all dark and kind of purple and blue, like it's in the shadows. But in the background, we see what looks like a castle, and there's like a pretty forest surrounding it, and that's all colorful and vibrant. And in the clouds above the castle, there is a face hovering. It looks like it's made out of plants. Leaves are growing out of the bridge of this person's nose that cover his brows and around his cheeks. And he's not doing anything. He's just kind of looking out from the image. And we also see that this issue was written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the page, we start right where we left off with John in the room next to Syder, who's been possessed. And John begins lighting candles and cutting open his hand in order to do some kind of ritual. And over these panels, the narration says, "I remember the last time. I remember the smell of incense, the excitement of the chase, a desperate flight from a million troubled souls, and how it felt before the pain set in. Afterwards, I thought there was nothing left intact, that all my physical, emotional, and spiritual bones had been broken. But pain's just relative, isn't it? A cat scratch is painful, but so is a bayonet up the arse. Now I found out what it really means to hurt. I found who I am, just when I thought I could never go any lower. I'm falling through the underside of hell." So as we see John finishing all the preparations for the ritual, he says to the demon, "Come on, you bastard, right out where I can see you." And with that, a bunch of ectoplasm begins to come out of the boy's mouth, and we can hear Buer yelling, "Ah!" And then all that ectoplasm forms into a cloud, and Buer's face appears in it. And it speaks to John saying, "You cannot undo, John Constantine. Even if I am seen, mine is the bond of debt, unbreakable. The child is mine by right, until such time as I am paid." And John gets angry at this, so he yells out, "You have no fucking right, and you know it. So let's get to the point before you really piss me off. Who are you, demon? What do you want?" And the demon replies, "I want what I have, mage, and what I have had. I want to watch you wallow in the excrement you've created. Do you really think I would give you my naming, when others may better speak for me?" Then we see the figure of Astra appear, so it seems Buer has her soul at his command as well. And of course this pisses John off, and he says, "Don't you fucking dare, you tosser. I'll do you, I swear." But it seems Buer likes getting this reaction out of John because he says, "He doth protest too much, methinks. Louder, John Constantine, So your conscience cannot hear you cry. And John is kind of taken aback by this, so as he kind of recovers, the narration says, the cocky little shite thinks he's onto a winner, but I'm too gobsmacked to see what it is. It's early yet. I have to slow it down. So John recomposes himself, lights a cigarette, and says, so what's this have to do with me then, you shanky little touch-hole? And Buer replies, you, Constantine? Why, you are one of us, at least in part. And then a bunch of children appear in the smoke next to Buer's head, and he continues saying, these are my possessions, mortal. All these precious children may be owned by no other demon. That I am owed by Nergal is certain, as surely as his blood remains in your veins. So, by the rules of engagement, I am staking my claim to the child. So Buer is basically saying, hey, Nergal owed me something. You have Nergal's blood in your veins now that he's dead or gone. So you must pay his debts because you have his blood in your veins. And as John thinks on what he just heard, the narration says, I don't believe it. The clever git. It's a loose interpretation, but he's obviously found a loophole in the rules. Me mate's son has suddenly become fair game, and all because a demon once saved my life. All because of me. Then we turn the page and we cut to a street where John is waiting on a sidewalk, and it's pouring rain outside, and we see someone running to approach John. And this person is wearing a red hoodie, and as he looks up, we can see that his face doesn't have normal skin on it. It is covered with what looks like leaves. And as the man approaches, John says, hello, Jack. Feeling a bit iffy then. And Jack looks up and says, Constantine, yon serpent asked me to meet you here. Have you decided how we can repay thee? And we also see on this page that the issue is called Critical Mass Part 2, Troubled Waters. And as we turn the page, we see John very rudely blowing smoke into Jack's face. And he says, hold your horses, mate. One coffin nail at a time, eh? And the smoke sends Jack into a coughing fit, and as John waits and watches, his narration says, poor sod. It's not his fault, but I have to let him think I'm in charge. Too much writing on this. I thought he'd be all windswept and interesting. Stands to reason he'd look like shit. These days, the British countryside's reeling from the effects of civilization. All the mystical sites are being replaced with council houses. Our dreams getting smaller and smaller, and the poor old green man, the embodiment of the land essence, he's as sick as a parrot. So it seems that this person, Jack, is some sort of elemental or the embodiment of the British countryside. And that means he's not doing too well because, like John said, it's all becoming urbanized and buildings and stuff and construction are happening. And there's less and less of the open British countryside around. And in this panel underneath this narration, we do see what looks like the body of this elemental Jack being crushed by what looks like, I don't know, just an interpretation of industrialization. So as Jack recovers from sneezing, he says, Achoo! Yon swamp creature, the elemental, told us you'd be difficult. And as John lights another cigarette, he says, yeah, well, what do you expect from a cabbage? But it doesn't seem like Jack is amused by John's joke because he says, John, know thee, I can't tarry this place. What do you want? And John replies, simple, mate. I want to go to Abaton. And Jack's face looks very shocked at this, and he kind of reels back and he says, no, that's impossible. Like using a wish to ask for 1,000 more. But John's not taking no for an answer, and he grabs Jack's jacket and he pulls him to him and he says, listen, you tosser. Right now, my existential crisis is having an existential crisis, so I don't have time to fart about. You know the drill. Bend over and take it like a man. And a very worried Jack replies, I have to ask him. It ain't my decision, John, as you well know. But John is turning away from him as Jack is saying this, and as he walks away, John says, ask away then, mate. You know as well as I do. If you can't pay up, you belong to me. And as John walks on the sidewalk, he's thinking to himself, and his narration says, subtle as a road accident, that's me. I leave the poor sod to his own problems and swagger off, feeling like the school bully. I've bloodied his nose and turned my back, cool as a cucumber, but trembling inside. Back in the world of neon lights, it all seems darker than before. It's a strange feeling to have everything opening up and closing in at the same time. The universe unfolds. Me, I'm the Hubble telescope. Then we get a flashback of what happened between this time when John met Jack and him leaving Syder's room. So we see John walking out of Syder's room through the door and into the kitchen where Rich and Michelle are waiting with tea. And John's narration says, "Just to lessen the guilt, I think back to the night before. I'd managed to pull the ectoplasm out of Syder, just enough to ease the poor little bugger's pain. But the demon's claim was obviously strong enough to root him in the physical plane. I'd left him attached to the boy, but separated. A kind of psychic Mexican standoff. Out in the kitchen, me mates were reacting as best they could. The minions of hell had barged into the soul of their only child, so Michelle had made a pot of tea. I wandered in nervously, wondering what on earth I was going to tell them. It's times like that you wonder how someone can have so little and still have everything to lose." So as John walks in the kitchen, Michelle looks up at him with a smile and passes a cup of tea and says, "Here you are, John. Looks like you could handle a cuppa." And then Rich tries to break the tension by joking, saying, "Marvelous, isn't it? One minute they're sucking on a tit, and before you know it, they're Linda, Sod, and Blair." But then he tags on a real question, saying, "What's occurring then, con job? Is he all sorted?" And John doesn't say anything to either of them. He just kind of stands there trying to collect his thoughts, and his narration says, "Rich's reaction had thrown me. I mean, there he was, taking it in his stride, and all my best laid plans for skirting around the supernatural aspects had become pointless, really. So, just for a laugh, I told them the truth. I told them about Newcastle and running through hell with an innocent child, and how I damned her with my mistake. I told them how Syder's possession was my fault, and I waited for the shit to fly." But the shit doesn't really fly. Rich just looks up at John and says, "Listen, John, you did what you could. Just do what you can for me, boy, eh?" And Michelle seems a little bit more affected by that story because all she can say is, "Oh, God." Then we cut to John back outside walking in the rain. His narration says, "Just like that. No anger, no recriminations, just a nod and an encouraging word. Another reminder of how little I really know. That's me, with all the answers to the mysteries of the cosmos and the spiritual agility of a soap dish." Then we turn the page and we cut to what I think is a dream from John. We're seeing a black room with Victorian fireplace, and Astra's in there, and she's waving, saying, "John, I'm over here." And then behind her, we see Buer appear in the darkness, and she says to John, "What is it? What's wrong?" And then we see what she's seeing, and it's John hanging by a bunch of hooks, kind of like Hellblazer, but instead of in their skin, they're just in his jacket, and they're holding him back as he yells, "He's behind!" Then she turns around and notices Buer is there. Her body begins to fall to pieces, and as her torso falls to the ground and she reaches out with her left arm, which is her only arm, John tries to reach out to her, saying, "Reach, Astra! Give us your hand!" And he is actually able to grab her left hand, but as he pulls back, the arm comes off, and Buer stands on Astra's back. And Astra yells, "Oh no, John, please, don't let him get me." And before John can do anything, Buer reaches down and grabs her by the hair, and as he's still standing on her back, he pulls her head up so she's kind of bent backwards, and then Buer pulls out a knife and says, "Will you fight then, mage, or are you too afraid to try?" And as he puts the knife to her neck, John yells out, "No, I don't want to. What do you want?" And then we get a close-up on the knife pressing against her neck, and then the next panel zooms out, and we see the neck he's holding the knife next to is actually Syder's now. And Buer says, "An exchange, John Constantine. Your soul for the child's." Then we turn the page and we cut to the next day where John is standing where he met Jack of the Green for the first time on the sidewalk next to the street. And John's narration says, "So, all the cards are on the table then. Another friggin' mess. I'm hoping the Green Man's managed to pull a few strings, because getting to Abaton is far more important now. Even so, I'm surprised when the cunning little wanker shows up." So this time, instead of running across the street, Jack of the Green runs up behind John and grabs him from the shoulder and says, "Ready then, Jester?" And John gets scared because, someone just randomly grabs him in the middle of the street, and he yells out, "Shit!" But Jack of the Green doesn't really take time to talk. He just takes off running and says, "'Tis strange to see thee so caught off guard, John, and looking so poorly, too." And as John begins to run after him, he says, "Yeah, well, I had a bad night, didn't I? Where are you off to then?" And Jack replies, Right ahead, John. There lies the road to Abaton. And then John catches up to him and actually stops him and says, hang on. You mean they went for it? Just like that? And Jack replies, they wanted us to come. And I'll admit to being surprised. Come on. And as Jack leads John, we get some narration that says, amazing, isn't it? How a bad night's sleep can knock you up for a week? While I'm still trying to take it all in, Jack's already halfway to parts unknown. Funnily enough, the way to Abaton leads right down Streatham High Street, and I'm too busy breathing a sigh of relief to think, how strange. It's a little-known legend is Abaton, the town of changing locations. Philosophers, mystics, and clever bastards in general have known of its existence for centuries. It's a magical, wondrous place that embodies the essence of the British Gestalt and serves as a respiratory for all human knowledge. Pops up all over the place, always just at the edge of the horizon, always just out of reach. Then we get a little flashback of a man riding in a horse and carriage, and out of the back he's pointing at a city in the distance, and the narration continues saying, Sir Thomas Bulfinch claimed to have seen it back in the 1890s, but no one believed him. They all knew he was so full of shit his eyes were brown. It didn't help any that when he went back to find it the day after, Abaton was long gone, and he looked like a total twat in front of his mates. Hardly surprising that he never found it, though. And as Jack leads John into what looks like a Victorian version of England, John says to him, we'll not be taking the bus then, Jack? And then Jack kind of points to all the Victorian stuff and he says, 'tis a cullion you are, John, but sharp as a knife. You see it now? And John looks at him and says, I see it. So they keep walking down the street because I think this is just the road to Abaton. And John's narration says, the road to Abaton is right where you'd never expect it to be. Right in plain sight. The trick to getting there is not to go looking for it. You let it look for you. So as they're walking down, it becomes more and more rural, and John stops next to a tree and says, hold on a minute, I need a ciggy. And with a smile on his face, Jack replies, do so then, John. I can wait. As John opens the box, all of a sudden he sees that his cigarettes have sprouted into full-blown plants. And John yells, me fags. And Jack begins to laugh, saying, ha ha, they seem so sad, Jester. I just gave them back their green. And then he takes off running, and as John watches him run away, John's narration says, the one thing I can't stand about fairies is all the deception and pouncing about. As I follow the green man up the narrow path, visions of electric hedge trimmers go swimming through my brain. And then John yells out a sarcastic joke saying, you're in a beautiful wooded area with flowers, blah, blah, blah. A strange fairy laughs at you from the trees. You kick his bloody head in, blah, blah, blah. So this is kind of like a veiled threat that they're taking too long to get there, I think. But Jack turns around and says, look, Jester, up on the hill. 'Tis what few others have seen, John Constantine, and fewer ever have reached. Our moving town of Abaton. And then he points through the woods, and through the trees we can see what looks like a castle's wall. And there's a stone archway in it. And as we turn the page, we see that John and Jack are walking through that archway now. And Jack is saying, remember, Jester, though they each carry the answers to all of life's mysteries, our villagers know not of the outside. You may ask one, but my attorneyship runs the game. And John replies, you're the boss, Jack. So Jack waves John in and says, enter then, for by right, 'tis what you've earned. And as John walks into the city of Abaton, we see it kind of looks like a Ren fair. Like there's a tavern called the Bell, and all the people walking around are wearing 1600s clothes. And as John takes this all in, his narration says, if I didn't know any better, I'd swear I was in a director's box at Wembley. A cast of thousands, the best and brightest of British legend, are all milling around the local pub. Looks can be deceiving, of course, but this place hardly seems like the repository of all human knowledge. Then a woman walks up to Jack and John and says, oh, Jack, is this your mortal friend? And Jack replies, he is, Mayren. And then she walks right up to John and kisses him on the lips and says, then a kiss for you, John, and welcome. And John is kind of taken aback, but he's not saying no. And as John kind of smiles at Jack, Jack says, off with you, girl. He needs none of your glamours. And Mayren replies, oh, you, a Jack by name and by nature too. And then Jack grabs John's arm and they begin to walk off. And John says to Jack, that's your bird then, is it? Nice one. And Jack replies, not mine, John, though she'll fondly try. Then they watch as she walks over to a man sitting down at a table and she blows a kiss to him. And the man at the table doesn't respond to her. And John says, I take it the happy bastard's her boyfriend then. And Jack replies, that's Robert the Smith, Poor soul, the wench brought him here, but she cares little for his heart. Robert lived near the forest a long time ago. A good man, but a dullard. His proximity to Fairy was his undoing, yet his only crime was his youth and vigor, as I recall. Mayren had a taste for mortal souls, and Robert was unqualified, lacking the imagination to refuse her. She appeared at his door one eve, dripping for him. After realizing her mistake, the vain little Jiglet decided to make Robert appear more than just a man. So, she fed idle reports of his bravery and cunning to all around. She whispered to the sheriff one night that Robert did refuse his tribute to the king. Angered, the sheriff sent his soldiers to find this evil man. Having no kin to protect him, Robert left behind his forge and fled into the green. I watched him die slowly and sadly, with no fire to warm him and nowhere else to go. All the while, he was unaware of the stories being told about him. Stories of a strong man, a man who had stolen from the rich, a hooded man. And as this story is being told by Jack, we're getting some panels that show exactly what he's saying. So we see Robert as a blacksmith, then Robert being approached by Maywen, then him running in the woods for his life as soldiers chase him, and then him sitting in the rain, unable to start a fire. But like Jack was saying, as the man sat there and died apparently, this whole myth about him robbing from the rich and wearing a hood started, and John puts two and two together and points at Robert and says, "Christ almighty, you mean this poor sod is Robin Hood?" And then he begins to walk towards him, and Jack's kind of surprised and says, "John, leave him be." But John ignores him and walks over to Robert, and he hands Robert his lighter and says, "Here you are, mate. This is for you. It'll make you a nice fire." And as Robert stares at the lighter, Jack runs over and pulls John away and says, "Come away, John. Poor Robert's no use to you." And John follows him hesitantly and says, "Yeah, all right. Jesus." But as he's being pulled, we see him kind of side-eye back to Robert, who's looking at him, and John's narration says, "No use, eh? Well, judging by Jack's reaction, you could have fooled me." So it seems like John has something up his sleeve. And as we turn the page, we see John and Jack walking down an alley, and John asks Jack, "So what's the plan, Stan? Or is this it?" And Jack replies, "I told thee, John, that thou canst ask but one. All these townsfolk have answers, but you must ask our scribe." And John replies, "Oh, smashing." And then John's narration says, "Course, I should have expected this. As usual, everyone's playing by their own set of rules. Abaton holds all the answers I need. I just have to find the right way to ask. It's so totally bum-numbingly bizarre that I can't help but laugh, despite the circumstances. If Abaton's the unearthly reflection of all that we are, Britain's in far worse shape than I thought." Then we see Jack run a little bit ahead of John until he gets to a house, and he waves to it and says, "Here, a sight to behold, eh, Jester?" And the house kind of looks like a steampunk version of a Victorian house. There's like a big metal tank on the top of it, and then there's pipes coming out of that snake through the windows. And there's also what looks like an engine and a propeller on top of that. And John doesn't seem very impressed because he looks up at it and says, "Absolutely average, Jack." Then we cut to the inside of the house where a man is working on something mechanical in his garage. And as the doorbell rings, he says, "Not now, go away." But the doorbell doesn't stop, and he yells, "I said, oh, hang it to hell." So he goes to the door, and as he answers it, we see a full body shot of him. So we can see that this man isn't just into building machines. His body is partly made up of them. So he has like a robotic leg and a robotic jaw and radio receivers coming out of his ears. And he also has what looks like a mechanical eye. So as he opens the door and sees Jack, he says, "I said I was, oh, it's you. I suppose you better come in." And as Jack walks in and motions to John to come in, John says, "Tell me this isn't the one, Jack, because I'm not in the fucking mood for games." And Jack replies, "He is, John. Best come inside now." And as they walk in, John kind of pulls him aside and says, "Listen, Sunshine, you bloody owe me, if this is your way of prating me about." But Jack answers, "We're all well aware, Jester, of our deadings. Yon scribe may speak as well as any in Abaton." So they walk in and they follow the scribe to where he was working in his garage, and Jack asks him, "Thou art busy, I see, brother, and so I ask forgiveness for our intrusion. My friend here is John." And the scribe says, Yes. State your business, please, Mr. Constantine." And then the scribe begins kind of examining John, and as John looks back at him, he says, "Oh well, and for a penny. I've got this mate, see?" And the scribe cuts him off saying, "I know the question, sir. The demon who holds sway over the soul of your friend's child. His name is Buer, Mr. Constantine. That is all." And John kind of takes a second to think about that, and he says, "Buer? Christ. That was one of Aleister Crowley's playmates, the stupid Scottish sod. All right, next question. But the scribe cuts him off saying, I said that's all. And then he begins to walk away from John, and John kind of yells at him saying, hang on, I ain't finished yet. But the scribe yells back to him, well, I am, sir. Good day to you, and to you too, Jack Green. And as Jack smiles and kind of gives like a thank you to the man, John turns to Jack and says, you brought me all the way to see the bionic bloody man for this? You said I could ask him anything. And Jack replies, not I, Jester. I said, you may ask one, and that you did. The serpent's debt to thee is paid in full, 1 for 1. So if you didn't pick it up before, I think that this man, Jack the Green, is working on behalf of the Rainbow Serpent from Australia, because it did owe John a favor. So John isn't very to hear that his favor is now wasted and that he only got one question. So he very angrily says to Jack, what? You think I'm stupid, you bloody Nancy boy? Some people. You're trying to pull a fast one on the geezer who wrote the sodden book. It's 1 for 1, sunshine. And I know where to collect. So John rushes out of the house and he begins to walk down the street. And Jack and the scribe follow him out. And as they're in the doorway, the scribe says, surly fellow, Jack. And Jack replies, aye, brother scribe, but he has me, and it didn't take him long. Then we turn the page and we cut to John barging into the pub, where he immediately finds Robert the Smith drunk at a table, and he yells, oi, I want a word with you, chum. And Robert looks up from the table and says, nah, go away. But John comes over and sits down at his table and says, bollocks, mate, you owe me for the lighter, and I want an answer in return. And Robert looks up and says, please, brother, I want no part of it. But John hits the bottle out of his hand and says, do I look like I care? Your mates tried to rip me off, so now it's your problem. Come on, you tosser. What happens to me? What fucking happens? And at this, Robert gives in and he says, oh, friend, forgive me. You showed a kindness, and I can only give you damnation in return. The answer, then, is this. A judgment has been made of you, John Constantine, and when you die, your soul is bound for hell. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So they leave us on a big cliffhanger in the middle of Abaton, but at least now he knows that Buer is the demon who is possessing Syder. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains@comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.